People like you don't fly in first class. You should wait outside with the others. That single sentence, sharp and humiliating, cut through the air like a knife and left the entire first-class cabin frozen in disbelief. The words came from Sarah Bennett, the senior flight attendant, and in that moment she didn't just speak to one man, she exposed a prejudice that has been whispered, hidden, and denied for years. Yet here it was, broadcast live into thousands of homes through a young passenger's phone. Before we dive into this powerful story, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments, hit subscribe, and give this video a like so stories like this reach the world. Now let us begin. James Carter, a 48-year-old man dressed in a sharp Armani suit, polished shoes, and a watch worth more than most people's cars, walked calmly into the cabin of Delta Flight 1732. He wasn't just another passenger, though no one around him knew it yet. James was the chairman of Delta Airlines, the man who signed off on billion-dollar decisions, the man who had grown up in the shadow of his father's pain, a father who once told him of being humiliated and denied a seat on a flight decades ago simply because of his skin color. That memory never left him. And now James was here, undercover, determined to see if his airline had truly changed or if the complaints he had been reading, 52 discrimination reports in just the last quarter, were still a living reality inside the cabins of his own company. He sat down quietly in seat 1A, opened his leather folder, and waited. Sarah Bennett spotted him within seconds, her eyes narrowing with suspicion instead of hospitality. She had been with the airline for 10 years, but pressure and insecurity had twisted her judgment. One reprimand in the past for misjudging a passenger left her defensive, and when she saw James, all she could think was that he didn't belong. She leaned toward a colleague and muttered words she thought no one could hear. But Ava Thompson, a 23-year-old influencer seated just a few rows back, heard it all. Ava, always alert to injustice, had her phone out in an instant, within seconds. She was live streaming, her audience of 10,000 quickly climbing as she whispered to her viewers, "You won't believe what's happening on this plane." Sarah walked up to James with a tight smile that carried no warmth and said, "Sir, this is first class. May I see your boarding pass?" James, calm and composed, handed it over without hesitation. She studied it, frowned, and then whispered again to her colleague, "This doesn't look right. He doesn't look like he belongs here." Ava's audience exploded with comments. "That's racism. She's targeting him. Why are they questioning him?" By the time Sarah returned, her suspicion had hardened into open accusation. She raised her voice, accusing James of using a stolen ticket. Her words were sharp, cutting, fueled by fear of losing authority in front of passengers. James looked at her without flinching, his expression calm, almost too calm, and that quiet composure only enraged her further. "People like you don't fly in first class," she repeated, louder now, unaware that every syllable was being broadcast live to tens of thousands. James checked his watch, a subtle signal to himself and to the legal team waiting for his message. He sent a short text. "It's begun. Ready the protocol." Ava's live stream grew to 25,000 viewers, then 50,000, as Sarah demanded Captain Michael Hayes come forward. Hayes, a veteran with 25 years of flying behind him, stepped out of the cockpit, his presence commanding, his uniform crisp. He took the boarding pass from Sarah, studied it, and saw immediately that it was valid. Yet Sarah pressed on, insisting that something wasn't right. "Check it again, Captain," she said firmly. "You can't just let him sit here. Something's off." Passengers stirred uncomfortably, phones lifted, cameras recording. A businessman in 1C shook his head, tapping his Rolex in frustration. Others whispered, some supporting Sarah, others appalled. The tension in the air grew heavy, pressing on every heart in the cabin. James, however, remained composed, He looked at Sarah with eyes that carried not just the weight of the moment, but of generations before him. "Ms. Bennett," he said in a voice that was calm but unyielding. "Assumptions have a cost. Are you prepared to pay it?" She scoffed, muttering to her colleague, "I know a fraud when I see one." Ava's stream captured it all, and by now the hashtag Delta discrimination had begun to trend on social media. Viewership passed 75,000. CNN producers sent messages to Ava, NBC anchors were quoting her live comments, and people across the nation leaned forward to watch this confrontation unfold in real time. In the cockpit, Hayes felt a flicker of doubt. He remembered his own biracial daughter, remembered the day she confronted him about a removal decision that still haunted their family dinners. He looked at James, then back at Sarah, and felt his authority slipping into uncertainty. James, meanwhile, kept his composure. He wasn't here to win an argument. He was here to expose the truth. Inside his jacket pocket was a card, plain and simple. That held his real identity. But it wasn't time to reveal it yet. He wanted to see how far Sarah and Hayes would go, how much bias they would expose before the world. Ava's live stream soared to 100,000 viewers, comments pouring in. "This is unbelievable. Stay calm. Brother, we're with you. Expose them." James leaned back in his seat. The quiet storm before the revelation, every word, every glance, every decision in that cabin was now history in the making, what no one knew, except James and his waiting legal team. Was that this incident was about to cost Delta more than $1 billion in lost value? It was about to trigger a federal investigation. It was about to change the way airlines across America trained their crews and treated their passengers. And in the middle of it all sat James Carter, a man calm enough to wait, strong enough to endure the insult, and determined enough to turn humiliation into the spark of systemic change. This was only the beginning. But the world was already watching. The cabin was thick with unease as if every breath carried tension. Ava Thompson's live stream had already surged past 75,000 viewers, and the number kept climbing with every passing second. Her phone balanced carefully on the armrest while she whispered commentary to her swelling audience. Sarah Bennett stood rigid in the aisle, her jaw clenched, her hands twitching as though she was both terrified and determined to push this further. She could feel her authority slipping away, and that fear hardened into aggression. Captain Michael Hayes, standing a step behind her, tried to command the situation with his years of authority. But even he was beginning to sense that something about this confrontation was spiraling beyond protocol. He cleared his throat, his voice steady but carrying an edge of hesitation as he addressed James Carter. "Sir, in order to proceed, I'm going to need to see a second form of identification." James, still calm, leaned back in seat 1A and slowly reached into his breast pocket. He produced a card that gleamed under the cabin lights, a Black American Express Centurion card, heavy metal, unmistakable, and so exclusive that its $15,000 annual fee was a barrier to almost everyone. He placed it calmly on the fold-down tray table. Passengers craned their necks, whispering. They knew exactly what that card meant. But Sarah scoffed loudly, her voice dripping with scorn as she declared, "That's probably fake. People like him find ways to get around the system." Gasps filled the cabin, and Ava's voice cracked with disbelief as she repeated the words for her audience. She said the Centurion card was fake. Comments exploded across the live stream. "This is insane. She's doubling down. They're digging their own graves." James, unshaken, let the silence hang for a moment, then leaned forward, his voice dropping into a low tone that carried more weight than any shout could. "Ms. Bennett, assumptions have a cost. Care to calculate it?" His words landed like a blow, quiet but lethal, and Sarah bristled, her pride pushing her further into the hole she was digging. "I know a fraud when I see one," she shot back, her voice rising, her eyes darting nervously to the cameras she could no longer ignore. Hayes shifted uncomfortably. His hands flexed at his sides as memories of his daughter filled his mind. The arguments they'd had when she confronted him about profiling. The silence that had grown between them at family dinners. The look of disappointment he couldn't erase. He could feel history repeating itself in front of him. And he was on the wrong side again. Just then, two figures appeared at the front of the cabin. Airport security officers Laura Chen and David Ruiz, summoned by Sarah in her desperation to enforce her authority. They carried zip ties in their hands. The message clear. They were ready to remove James Carter from the aircraft like a criminal. Passengers murmured nervously, some pulling out their phones to film, others looking away in shame. Ava's voice broke through the silence, firm and incredulous. They're calling security on him. This is happening live. You're all watching it. Her audience skyrocketed to 100,000 viewers, comments flying so fast the screen blurred. James, still composed, looked at the officers and spoke with precision, his tone calm but ironclad. Officers, before you act, you should be aware of Federal Aviation Regulation 91.11. Interfering with a passenger without lawful cause is a federal violation, and every camera in this cabin is recording. Chen hesitated, glancing at Ruiz, uncertain whether to proceed. Hayes opened his mouth to intervene, but Sarah cut him off, pointing sharply at James. He's holding up the flight. He doesn't belong here. Just remove him already. Her voice cracked with desperation, but she masked it with volume. The passengers shifted, the tension in the cabin nearly unbearable, at that exact moment. Hayes's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, and the caller ID made his blood run cold. Elizabeth Harper, Senior Vice President of Operations. He answered quietly, but her voice was sharp, urgent, and carried enough authority to slice through his hesitation. Stand down, Captain. Do not escalate this any further. We are monitoring the live stream in real time. Hayes swallowed hard, his face pale as he turned back towards Sarah. But she refused to back down, her fear of losing face twisting into stubbornness. Meanwhile, James casually pulled out his phone and glanced at the screen. A draft press release was already open. Prepared by his legal team, Delta Airlines faces $1.2 billion discrimination crisis. He let the screen glow faintly, a silent reminder of the storm about to break. Ava's audience exploded past 100,000 viewers, and now CNN anchors were quoting her stream. NBC producers were messaging her for interviews, and hashtags like Delta discrimination and justice in the sky were climbing to the top of national trends. James leaned forward slightly, his voice soft but unmistakably clear as he addressed Sarah directly. You'll regret this in 30 seconds. The words hung in the air like thunder before a storm, a prophecy that every passenger, every viewer, and even Sarah herself knew would come true. Hayes felt his knees weaken. Chen and Ruiz lowered their hands uncertainly. The businessman in 1C exhaled audibly, shaking his head in disbelief. Ava's phone shook slightly as she whispered to her viewers. You heard him. Something's about to happen. The cabin fell into a tense silence, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for the truth to be revealed. In that moment, James Carter was not just a man in seat 1A. He was the living embodiment of dignity under fire, patience under provocation, and quiet authority preparing to strike. And though Sarah Bennett still clung to her prejudice, though she still muttered about fraud and rules, the stage had already shifted. Power was no longer in her hands, nor in Hayes's, nor even in the officers who stood by uncertain. Power was in the calm of the man they had underestimated, a calm that promised their world was about to change forever. This was not just an argument over a seat. This was the ignition of a storm that would shake an entire airline, cost billions, and rewrite the way an industry thought about justice and equality. And as Ava's audience climbed past 120,000, the entire nation leaned closer, waiting for the moment when patience would give way to revelation. The silence in the cabin was suffocating, thick with anticipation, as all eyes remained fixed on James Carter sitting calmly in seat 1A. Ava Thompson's live stream had now surged to 125,000 viewers, and every second added thousands more. The comments scrolling so fast they blurred into a frenzy of outrage and solidarity. Officer Laura Chen extended her hand hesitantly toward James, ready to demand he stand. But James moved first, with deliberate calm. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a simple leather case, opening it slowly, almost ceremonially, before sliding a crisp business card across the tray table. The bold black letters gleamed under the cabin lights. James Carter, Chairman, Delta Airlines. The gasp that erupted in the cabin was instantaneous and unanimous, a collective shockwave that silenced even Sarah Bennett, whose face drained of color as though the floor beneath her had disappeared. Captain Hayes stammered, his lips moving but no words forming, his 25 years of service flashing before him as he realized the enormity of what had just unfolded. Officer Chen froze, staring at the card, while Ruiz stepped back, his eyes darting between James and Sarah as the reality settled like a thunderclap. Ava's live stream caught every detail, her voice trembling with awe as she narrated for her growing audience. "Oh my God, he's the chairman of Delta. You're watching this live. People. The man they accused of fraud owns the airline." The stream's numbers skyrocketed again, hitting 150,000, with hashtags like Delta discrimination and Chairman in 1A trending worldwide within minutes. James leaned forward, his calm demeanor now sharpened with authority, and tapped his tablet screen. Within seconds, a live video call filled the device, showing CEO Thomas Reed and Senior Vice President Elizabeth Harper, both seated in a conference room in Atlanta, their faces tight with fury. Reed's voice, booming with restrained anger, echoed through the cabin. "Why is my chairman being treated like a criminal on his own airline?" The weight of his words fell hard on Hayes, who swallowed nervously, and on Sarah, whose knees buckled as she nearly collapsed into the jump seat. James looked around the cabin, his eyes locking on Sarah with quiet intensity, then turning briefly to the officers, the captain, and finally the passengers, all of whom were now witnesses to a scandal that could not be contained. "This was not an accident," James declared, his voice calm but lethal, every syllable measured. "For months I have reviewed complaint after complaint, 2,500 incidents of discrimination in the past 5 years, 52 in just this last quarter alone, families humiliated, professionals embarrassed, people treated as less simply because of the color of their skin. Tonight, this crew decided to add one more story to that list. Only they chose the wrong man." Sarah shook her head weakly, trying to speak, but no words came out, her lips trembling, her pride crumbling beneath the crushing weight of exposure. Hayes attempted to interject, his voice cracking. "Mr. Carter, I didn't know." But James cut him off with a raised hand. "That's exactly the problem. Captain, you didn't know, because you never cared to look beyond your assumptions." Ava's camera zoomed slightly as James's voice grew heavier with emotion, his calm composure giving way to a flash of vulnerability. He reached into his suit pocket again and pulled out something small, aged, and worn. A faded boarding pass preserved carefully in a plastic sleeve. "This," he said softly, holding it up so that both the passengers and Ava's live stream could see, "belonged to my father in the 1980s. He was denied his seat on a flight, humiliated in front of strangers, told he didn't belong. He carried that wound with him for the rest of his life, and I swore that one day I would make sure no one else had to endure the same shame." Tonight, Ms. Bennett. You reminded me why that promise matters. The cabin fell into a silence so profound that even the hum of the engines seemed distant. Every passenger holding their breath as James's story reverberated through them. Ava's voice cracked with emotion as she whispered to her live stream. "This is history. You're watching history." Her viewers surged to 160,000, comments exploding with solidarity, grief, and outrage. "We stand with James Carter. This is America in 2024, and it's still happening. Never again." James then tapped his tablet again, switching the display to a stock ticker that updated in real time. "Look at this," he said, his voice sharp, businesslike, undeniable. The screen showed Delta Airlines shares dropping by 8.5% in just 20 minutes. A staggering $1.2 billion loss in market value triggered by a single live stream. Gasps filled the cabin. Sarah clutched her chest, the gravity of her actions pressing down like a physical weight. Hayes closed his eyes, regret flooding him. Memories of his daughter's angry words. "You don't understand what it feels like to be judged for who I am." Now pounding in his ears, "Every decision has consequences." James continued, his voice steady again. "Tonight, those consequences belong to this crew. But tomorrow, they will belong to the entire industry if we don't change." Ava panned her camera across the stunned passengers, some with tears in their eyes, others shaking their heads in disbelief. All united in witnessing a reckoning unfold in real time. Sarah finally found her voice, but it was faint, trembling. I didn't mean..." James fixed his gaze on her, his eyes unflinching. "You didn't mean to be caught," he replied coldly. "But you meant every word." His tone sliced through her defenses, leaving her silent once more. The tension in the cabin had transformed into something else entirely. An understanding that this was no longer just about one man, one flight, or one crew. It was about an entire nation grappling with the cost of bias. Ava's live stream ticked past 170,000, her viewers now demanding accountability, her name trending alongside James's, her young face suddenly thrust into the spotlight of a movement. Outside, though the passengers couldn't see it yet, news helicopters had already begun circling Miami International Airport, their cameras capturing the growing crowd of protesters gathering at the arrivals terminal, holding hastily made signs with words like "justice," "dignity in flight," and "no more." Inside, James Carter sat back in his seat, his expression calm but his eyes burning with purpose, knowing that the revelation was complete, that the truth had been laid bare, and that the world was watching as a storm of change began to rise around them. This was the moment he had prepared for. This was the moment his father's memory demanded, and this was only the beginning of a reckoning that would not end when the plane landed, but would echo across the industry, across the nation, and across history itself. Sarah Bennett collapsed into the jump seat, her chest heaving, the color drained from her face as though every ounce of authority she once held had been stripped away. The murmurs in the cabin cut into her like knives, passengers whispering words she couldn't escape: racist, disgrace, unfit. James Carter did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. His calm tone, steady and deliberate, carried more power than any shout. He looked directly at her and spoke with the weight of a man who had spent a lifetime in boardrooms, a man who understood the currency of dignity and consequence. 10 years. "Ms. Bennett," he said, pausing to let the silence deepen. 10 years of service. And when you looked at me, the first thing you saw was not a ticket, not a passenger, not a man who trusted you with his safety. What you saw was my skin, and that was enough for you to decide I didn't belong." Sarah squeezed her trembling hands together, shaking her head, whispering under her breath that she hadn't meant it. But James pressed forward, unmoved by her weak protest. Delta has received 52 complaints of discrimination just this quarter. He continued, raising his tablet so the numbers glowed for everyone to see. 85% of those incidents involved people of color. That's not chance. That's not coincidence. That's a pattern. And tonight you became part of it. His words were measured but merciless, each sentence striking like a gavel in a courtroom. He turned then to Captain Michael Hayes, who stood stiff, his face pale, his hand trembling against the overhead compartment. "And you, Captain," James said, narrowing his eyes. "You have 25 years of service. You've worn this uniform long enough to understand responsibility. Yet when confronted with a choice, you didn't protect a passenger. You protected a prejudice. Your record shows 19 removals from premium cabins over your career. 17 of those passengers were not white. Shall we pretend that's coincidence?" Hayes's lips parted, a faint no, escaping before he could stop himself, the shame crashing down as the faces of his passengers stared at him. As Ava Thompson's live stream captured every word for nearly 175,000 viewers who were now chanting in comments, "Accountability now, no excuses, expose them all." Ava's phone shook slightly as her voice narrated for her audience. "He's confronting the captain right now. He's showing the numbers. This is bigger than just one flight." James pressed on, shifting his gaze back to the entire cabin, his voice rising just enough to echo with authority. For years, bias has been excused, hidden behind policies and excuses, dismissed as misunderstandings. Tonight, the excuses end. He tapped his screen again, and a document appeared, filling the tablet display. "This is the Equity in Flight program," he said firmly. "A $15 million initiative that I began drafting 6 months ago. Preparing for this very moment. Body cameras on all crew, independent audits of complaints, zero tolerance for bias, and training that doesn't just check boxes, but changes culture." Passengers gasped softly, some nodding, others wiping their eyes, even the businessman in 1C, who earlier seemed impatient, now stared at James with quiet respect. Sarah's tears began to fall as the enormity of her actions became clear. But James was not finished. He swiped again, and a new document appeared, a class action lawsuit template with bold numbers stamped across the page. 2,500 plaintiffs. He read aloud, each with a potential settlement value of $450,000. Total liability, $1.125 billion. He let the figure hang in the air, a figure larger than Sarah could comprehend, larger than Hayes could bear. The cabin erupted in hushed gasps, Ava whispering for her audience. "He's showing them a lawsuit right now. He's showing them the billions this could cost." James leaned closer to Sarah, his eyes piercing through her shame. "You have a choice. Ms. Bennett. Both of you do," he said, shifting his gaze to Hayes. "Confess your actions on national television, admit your bias, and use your shame to help build something better. Or," he let the pause stretch, "or lose everything, your careers, your pensions, and face personal liability of $2.5 million each. Confess, or be destroyed by your own arrogance." Sarah's sobs grew louder, her pride warring with her fear of ruin, her thoughts spinning to her daughter at home, the daughter who looked up to her, the daughter she had promised to give a better life than she'd known. The image of her child's face cut through her defenses, and she covered her mouth with her trembling hands, realizing that her words tonight might one day be replayed to her daughter as proof of who she was. Hayes closed his eyes, his daughter's voice echoing in his head. The same daughter who had walked away from the dinner table years ago when he dismissed her pain, telling him he would never understand what it felt like to live in her skin. His voice cracked as he whispered, "My God, what have I done?" The cabin held its breath, passengers transfixed by the sight of authority figures unraveling before their eyes, undone not by violence, not by force, but by truth. Ava's stream soared to 175,000 viewers, her audience demanding justice, some chanting James's name, others calling for Delta to reform immediately. Outside. The protests in Miami grew louder, though the passengers inside only felt the vibrations in their chests, as though the chants of justice were echoing through the very fuselage of the plane. James straightened, his voice once again calm, composed. Final. Confess or lose everything, he repeated, his ultimatum delivered not as a threat, but as a sentence already written. Sarah buried her face in her hands. Hayes looked away, unable to meet James's eyes, and the cabin remained frozen, united in the understanding that history was unfolding in front of them. This was no longer just about one confrontation on one plane. It was a reckoning, a demand that bias be confronted, confessed, and dismantled. And though the engines hummed steadily beneath them, preparing for descent, it was clear to everyone on board that nothing about this flight would ever be ordinary again. The descent into Miami began, the plane tilting gently downward, but the atmosphere inside the first-class cabin was anything but calm. Tension swirled like a storm as the weight of James Carter's ultimatum pressed down on Sarah Bennett and Captain Michael Hayes, and every passenger knew they were witnessing a moment that would echo beyond this flight. James sat steady in seat 1A, his tablet still glowing with the lawsuit template and the details of the equity and flight program. His composure unshaken, though his eyes carried the exhaustion of a man reliving his father's humiliation even as he fought to prevent it from happening again. Ava Thompson's live stream continued to soar, now at 190,000 viewers. The comments flying so quickly her phone seemed alive with fire. Stay strong, James. This changes everything. Never again in silence. Sarah's sobs grew louder, her body trembling as she clutched her scarf with white knuckles, her pride collapsing under the crushing realization that her career, her reputation, and her role as a mother were all on the line. "I didn't think I was racist," she choked out, her voice raw, broken, echoing across the stunned cabin. I was scared. I was wrong. I was blind." The passengers stared at her, some with disdain, others with pity, all knowing that her words, however genuine they seemed, could never erase the moment when she had told James that people like him didn't belong. James did not flinch, did not soften, though in his heart he understood the power of confession. He leaned forward slightly, his voice carrying calm authority. "Your daughter will see this one day. Ms. Bennett, what story will you tell her? That you doubled down in arrogance, or that you faced your own ugliness and chose to change?" Sarah covered her face, shaking violently, the mention of her daughter breaking her remaining defenses. Captain Hayes, pale and sweating, stared straight ahead, his breathing shallow. At last he spoke, his words halting, fragile. "I failed. I failed as a captain. I failed as a father. My daughter is biracial, and I swore I would never let bias shape my choices. But tonight I chose fear over courage. I don't deserve this uniform if it means I look away from truth." His voice cracked, his confession heavier than steel, and though shame consumed him, there was a flicker of release in admitting what he had buried for years. James nodded slowly, acknowledging the words without absolution. "Accountability begins with honesty," he said firmly. "But honesty without action is just noise." He lifted his tablet once more, reading aloud from the Equity in Flight press release prepared by his team. Effective immediately. Delta Airlines will implement mandatory anti-bias training, independent review of every discrimination complaint, and a zero-tolerance policy that applies to every crew member, regardless of rank. Bias has a cost, and tonight it cost this airline $1.2 billion in lost market value, but tomorrow it will cost more if we do not change. The passengers sat in stunned silence, some nodding, some wiping tears, others recording every word to share later, knowing they had witnessed not only humiliation, but transformation. Ava's stream was nearly at 200,000 viewers now, the comments filled with hashtags like dignity in flight and never again. Outside the cabin windows, faint but growing louder, the chants of protesters gathered at Miami International Airport reached their ears. Justice now! Justice now! The vibration of their voices seemed to shake the fuselage, a sound that drove home the reality that this was no longer just a passenger incident, but a national moment. James turned back to Sarah, his eyes stern. "You said you didn't think you were racist. The truth is, most people who harm others never think they are. Bias is not about thought. It's about action. You acted, and tonight the world saw it. Redemption is possible, but it will require more than tears." Sarah sobbed harder, the weight of her shame pressing her lower in her seat, her mind spinning with the knowledge that she would have to choose between public humiliation through confession or financial and professional ruin. Hayes exhaled heavily, leaning back against the wall, his confession already spilling into regret as he thought of his daughter's face. Hoping she might see in his weakness a willingness to finally change, James finally looked around at the passengers, speaking not only to the crew but to everyone present, and through Ava's camera, to the world beyond. What you saw tonight was not an isolated incident. It is part of a system that too often excuses prejudice, hides behind uniforms and policies, and hopes no one notices. But the world is watching now, and silence is complicity. I will not be silent. His words rang like a vow, and the passengers nodded, some audibly whispering their agreement, others recording in reverent silence. The plane continued its descent, the lights of Miami glittering faintly below, the promise of a media firestorm awaiting them on the ground. James's phone buzzed with updates from his legal team. The Department of Justice had already flagged the incident. The NAACP had issued a statement of support, and television anchors were preparing to lead the evening news with Ava's footage. James inhaled slowly, steadying himself, aware that his calm exterior hid the weight of a man shouldering not only his own dignity, but the legacy of his father and the expectations of millions watching. He leaned back in his seat, exhaustion flickering briefly in his eyes, then straightened again, determined not to show weakness in front of those who had doubted him, as the wheels prepared to touch down. He looked once more at Sarah and Hayes, his final words before landing echoing with measured clarity. "You have 20 minutes until we land. 20 minutes to decide whether you will face the world with honesty or be crushed by denial. The cameras are rolling, the people are watching, and history is being written in real time. Choose carefully, because tonight will follow you for the rest of your lives." The cabin was silent again, heavy with the gravity of choice, as the protests outside grew louder and closer, and the engines roared in their steady descent. The passengers, the crew, and the hundreds of thousands watching online all knew the truth. This flight was no longer just traveling from Chicago to Miami. It was carrying a nation into a reckoning long overdue. The landing gear thundered down, the cabin shuddering as Delta Flight 1732 touched the runway at Miami International. But inside the first-class cabin, the air was thick with dread and anticipation, as though every soul aboard knew they were part of something far greater than an ordinary arrival. James Carter remained composed in seat 1A, his Armani suit still sharp, his watch still gleaming, but his eyes burned with the weight of legacy and purpose. While across from him, Sarah Bennett sat trembling, tears streaking her face, and Captain Michael Hayes leaned stiffly against the bulkhead, his confession still hanging in the air like a cloud he could not escape. The doors hissed open, and the sound of chants crashed inside the plane like a wave. Justice now! Dignity in flight! No more discrimination! Protesters had gathered outside in the thousands, some holding signs, others waving their phones, live streaming the moment history was about to walk through the jet bridge, within seconds. Inspector Maria Torres of the Department of Justice boarded the aircraft, her presence commanding, her badge glinting under the harsh cabin lights. "This flight is now subject to a federal civil rights investigation," she declared, her voice echoing in the stunned silence, "and all parties involved will answer for their actions." Gasps rippled through the passengers. Ava Thompson, still streaming, whispered breathlessly to her audience, "You're watching this live. The DOJ is here. This is unprecedented." Her viewership ticked over 200,000. The chat exploding with messages. "Accountability is here. Thank God for James Carter. History in real time." James stood finally, his 6-foot frame commanding attention, and with deliberate calm he addressed not only the inspector, but the cabin and the cameras. "This is the Carter Protocol," he said, holding up his tablet with the finalized press release glowing on the screen. "A 6-month program developed to ensure equity in every cabin of every Delta flight. Now mandatory company-wide, effective immediately. Every crew will undergo anti-bias training. Every complaint will be reviewed by independent auditors. And every instance of prejudice will result in immediate suspension pending investigation. The time for excuses is over." Applause broke out from scattered passengers, their claps timid at first, but soon growing louder. Fueled by relief and admiration, Inspector Torres nodded firmly, already taking notes, already planning subpoenas, her expression hardened by years of investigating systemic injustice. Sarah Bennett sobbed openly now, clutching her face, whispering over and over, I didn't think. But her words carried no weight against the tidal wave of consequences. James turned his gaze on her, his voice measured but piercing. "You will face the cameras, Ms. Bennett. You will tell the truth, not because I demand it, but because the people deserve it. Redemption is possible, but only through honesty." Sarah nodded weakly, her body trembling, her pride shattered. Hayes, his face pale, spoke with a voice that cracked under the strain of shame. "I will confess as well," he said, his tone low, defeated but sincere. "I have failed too many times, but I will not fail again. If my daughter can forgive me, perhaps I can make something right before I'm gone." His words echoed with regret and the faintest glimmer of hope. Ava's live stream caught it all, her voice breaking with emotion as she narrated. "They're confessing live. They're admitting their bias on the record." Outside, the roar of protesters grew louder, the chants now mixed with cheers as the news spread across social media that the crew had begun to accept responsibility. James handed Inspector Torres a sealed folder, documents prepared weeks in advance. Inside, you will find data from the last 5 years. 2,500 incidents of discrimination logged, most ignored or dismissed, many settled quietly. This stops now. I will cooperate fully with the DOJ, the FAA, and the NAACP to ensure transparency. Torres took the folder, her eyes sharp, her voice steady as she replied. "We will hold every person accountable, Mr. Carter, but tonight you have also ensured that accountability extends to the system itself." The words carried through the cabin, through Ava's stream, through the hearts of the passengers who sat wide-eyed, realizing they were part of history unfolding, as Sarah and Hayes were escorted gently down the aisle toward the jet bridge. The passengers parted, their eyes following with a mix of judgment and pity. Outside, the cameras from CNN, NBC, and countless independent outlets waited, their microphones ready to capture confessions. Sarah, her face streaked with tears, stumbled before the crowd but managed to speak, her voice trembling yet audible. "I was wrong," she said into the sea of microphones. "I judged a man by his skin instead of his humanity, and for that, I will spend the rest of my life making it right." Her words, though imperfect, were broadcast instantly across the world, headlines flashing on screens in homes, bars, and airports everywhere. Hayes followed, his voice breaking, his hands shaking as he said, "I failed as a captain, as a father, and as a man of integrity. But I will no longer hide behind silence. I will use my voice to fight bias, not protect it." The crowd roared with a mix of anger and hope, some jeering, others clapping, all aware that confession was only the beginning of redemption. James stepped off the plane last. His presence met with chants of his name, cameras flashing, helicopters circling above, the media frenzy unmatched. He paused at the podium hastily set up by reporters and spoke with the gravitas of a leader who knew the weight of history. "This is not my victory," he said firmly. "This is for every passenger humiliated, every child shamed, every family disrespected because of bias in the skies. Tonight, Delta leads by example, but tomorrow the entire industry will follow. Equity in flight will not be a slogan, it will be the standard." The cheers were deafening, the chants echoing through the terminal as passengers, protesters, and millions watching online felt the shift in the air, the undeniable sense that something had changed. Ava ended her stream with tears in her eyes, her voice steady despite the emotion. "You all saw it," she said. "A man stood against injustice, and the world stood with him. This is dignity in flight, and it starts now." Her follower count doubled overnight, but more importantly, her footage became the cornerstone of a national movement. As James walked toward the awaiting convoy that would take him to Delta's Miami office, he glanced back at the sea of faces, the signs, the chants, and the lights. He thought of his father, thought of the faded boarding pass he still carried, and whispered under his breath, "We did it, Dad." And in that moment, the landing of Flight 1732 was no longer just the end of a journey from Chicago to Miami. It was the arrival of a new era in aviation, one where dignity, accountability, and justice could no longer be denied. 6 months later, the world of aviation looked very different, and the change could be traced back to the day Delta Flight 1732 landed in Miami. The Carter Protocol, once only a draft on James Carter's tablet, was now the backbone of Delta's operations and the standard every major U.S. airline had been forced to adopt after mounting pressure from the Department of Justice, the NAACP, and the millions of voices online who demanded dignity in flight. Complaints of discrimination had plummeted by 92% across the industry. Independent audits were now routine, and flight crews wore discreet body cameras that ensured transparency at every level of service. James, seated in his office on the top floor of Delta's Atlanta headquarters, looked out at the city skyline with quiet pride, knowing the legacy of his father's humiliation had finally been transformed into a movement that protected others from ever experiencing the same pain. Yet he also knew that this victory was not his alone. Sarah Bennett, once disgraced and vilified, had chosen the harder path: confession, accountability, and public redemption. In the months following her tearful admission, she traveled to more than 250 Delta hubs across the country, standing before rooms of skeptical employees and admitting, in detail, how her own bias had blinded her. At first, the crews looked at her with contempt, dismissing her words as hollow. But as she spoke about her daughter's tears, about the night she told her child she had made the biggest mistake of her life, something shifted. Hearts softened, walls lowered, and Sarah became a mirror in which others recognized their own unexamined prejudices. Slowly, painfully, she began to rebuild not her career, but her humanity. Her daughter, once ashamed, hugged her tightly after a training session in Dallas, whispering, "I'm proud of you, Mom." And in that moment, Sarah knew she had turned her downfall into a chance to give her child a better legacy. Captain Michael Hayes, too, carried his shame into the public square. his tall frame hunched by regret, but lifted by determination. He spoke often of his biracial daughter, of the dinners ruined by his silence, of the way she had once asked him through tears if he really saw her for who she was. His words resonated deeply with crews across the country, especially fathers, who realized the harm silence could do to those they loved most. Hayes never regained the authority of a cockpit, but he found a new calling as an advocate, speaking alongside Sarah in town halls and training rooms, using his failure as a warning and a lesson. Together, Sarah and Hayes became unlikely messengers of reform, their brokenness transformed into testimonies that helped heal an industry. Ava Thompson, the young influencer whose live stream had captured the world, had grown far beyond her online persona. She founded an organization called Dignity in Flight, which collected and documented passenger stories of bias, injustice, and courage, turning them into powerful short films and advocacy campaigns. One of the stories she championed came from Maria Gonzalez, a passenger who had been on Flight 1732, inspired by James's stand. Maria later confronted bias on a United Airlines flight, refusing to stay silent when another passenger was profiled. And her courage went viral in its own right, fueling the wider movement. Ava's platform exploded, her followers numbering in the millions. But more importantly, her work began influencing policy discussions in Congress, where lawmakers cited her videos as evidence of the urgent need for industry-wide reform. At Delta, James Carter invested $15 million into scholarships for minority students pursuing careers in aviation, creating opportunities for pilots, engineers, and executives who would one day redefine leadership in the skies, in classrooms across the country. Young men and women saw his face on posters with the words, "Your voice changes the world," a reminder that justice was not confined to boardrooms or courtrooms, but belonged to anyone brave enough to speak. The Equity in Flight program became a case study taught at business schools, praised by civil rights leaders, and even adopted in other industries where bias had long been ignored. Yet, for James, the most meaningful moments were not in the headlines or the board meetings, but in the quiet victories. He remembered walking through a Delta terminal one evening, unnoticed, and seeing a black father and his son board a plane with smiles on their faces, greeted warmly by the crew, no suspicion, no humiliation, only dignity. He thought of his own father then, the faded boarding pass he still carried close to his heart, and felt tears prick his eyes. "We did it. Dad," he whispered again, the same words he had spoken on the tarmac in Miami. But this time they carried not just triumph, but peace. Sarah's journey of redemption continued, but it was not easy. The internet never forgets. And there were always those who mocked her, who refused to forgive. Yet she pressed on, fueled not by the hope of public approval, but by the desire to prove to her daughter and to herself that change was real, possible, and worth fighting for. Hayes rebuilt his fractured relationship with his daughter, attending rallies with her, listening more than he spoke, and for the first time in years, she held his hand without pulling away. Ava, now recognized as one of the youngest and most effective activists in the nation, continued to amplify voices, telling not only stories of racism, but of sexism, ableism, and transphobia, broadening the fight for dignity across all barriers. James Carter, meanwhile, remained the steady architect of reform, balancing corporate leadership with social responsibility, his reputation no longer defined by the billions he managed, but by the dignity he restored. On the 6-month anniversary of Flight 1732, Delta held a ceremony at its Atlanta headquarters. Hundreds gathered, from executives to frontline staff, from passengers to activists. And in the front row sat Sarah's daughter, Hayes's daughter, and Ava, all symbols of the future this movement had created. James took the podium, his voice calm, steady, filled with both gravity and warmth. 6 months ago. I sat in seat 1A as a test. He said, "Tonight, I stand before you knowing that test changed us all. We confronted prejudice not with silence, but with truth. We faced shame not with denial, but with confession. And we built a future not of excuses, but of dignity." My father carried a wound from a flight in the 1980s that never healed. But today his legacy is not a wound. It is a shield for others. That is our victory. The audience erupted in applause, some standing with tears streaming down their faces, others raising their phones to record the moment, as the applause thundered on. James glanced at the framed boarding pass he kept on his desk. The faded paper that had once symbolized pain now transformed into a testament of progress. And in that moment, the story of Flight 1732 reached its final note, not as a tale of humiliation, but as a symphony of justice, redemption, and hope. A reminder that even in the confined space of an airplane cabin, the courage of one man could lift an entire industry into a new era of dignity. Thank you for watching and sharing. Your support means everything. If this story moved you, leave a comment, subscribe, and give it a like. See you next time.